Welcome to the National Arts Club. I'm Catherine Kleszczewski, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts, and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Today, we will talk about the ages and stages of 19th century women's clothing from the cradle to the grave. And with me to talk about this fascinating topic is the amazing author and curator, Erika Holst. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Erika Holst is the curator of history at the Illinois State Museum. Her most recent exhibition, Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900, highlighted the clothing worn by 19th century Illinois women. Holst has worked in the public history field for more than 15 years, during which time she has curated more than a dozen exhibitions. She is passionate about telling the story of people and the history through material culture. Holst's publications include Wicked Springfield, Crime, Corruption, and Scandal During the Lincoln Era, Edwards Place, A Springfield Treasure, and A Historic Houses of Lincoln's, Illinois, as well as several scholarly and popular articles. She holds an MA from the Winterthur program in Early American Culture and a BA from Illinois Wesleyan University. Please give a warm welcome to the one and only Erika Holst. Hi, Erika.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I will endeavor to live up to your kind words. So I'm just gonna start sharing my screen and go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about women's clothing from the cradle to the grave, diving into the ages and stages of 19th century women's clothing. So when we think about 19th century women's clothing, we might come up with kind of like a standard image of a sort of maybe hoop skirt era dress or a dress, you know, with a long skirt on it. And really, women's clothing was as complex in the 19th century as it was today. And each stage of a woman's life had sort of prescribed roles that society sort of asked of women and clothing that went along with it. So as we unpack the different types of garments that women wore throughout the course of their lifetime, we're also going to be unpacking who society expected women to be and the ways that women kind of conform to that or also carve their own space in American culture. And as you mentioned, this talk was inspired by an exhibition that ran at the Illinois State Museum from August 2021 to March 2022 that highlighted 19th century women's clothing, where we had an opportunity to really dig into our collection and bring the historic garments that had never seen the light today in front of the public so they could enjoy them. And in doing so, really dig into what these garments said about the women that wore them and the society that produced them. So starting with the lives of women and the clothing that they wore, sorry, we're just going to take a look at this image here, which I just love. It lent its title to the title of this presentation, Stages of Women's Life from the Cradle to the Grave. So you see women starting as infants on one side and peaking, it looks like the peak of a woman's life as defined by this 19th century image is like matronhood, sort of like early middle age, and then going to old age on the other side. We'll see how this corresponds to the garments that women wore. And of course, the place to start is at birth. And in the 19th century, infants were dressed generally in long clothes. So that baby dress that you see there is made of linen. This indicates it was probably like a spring summer garment. If it was worn in the fall or winter, it would probably have been of wool flannel. But baby dresses were long so that you could fold them over the baby's feet and keep them warm and kind of contained. Some people sort of see this and they think like christening gown, and that's not always the case. A christening gown will tend to be more like elaborately embroidered. Baby clothes in general were long while the child was immobile. They often had very simple fastenings, often just like a little like string tie in the back, no buttons or anything like that. So a very simple garment. Once the child became mobile, they were moved into a shorter dress. So the dress to the side of it is would have been considered a toddler dress, and both of these date from the 1820s to 1830s. And so as a little kid gets able to crawl and walk, then the dress shortens to permit freedom of movement. In the 19th century, gender distinctions were not important among small kids. Small kids were kind of their own little social category. It didn't matter if you were boys or girls, everyone wore these white clothes. And white actually was the most practical color to dress little kids in. It's the opposite today. But in the 19th century, white fabrics were the ones that would have been put in the scalding wash water and scrubbed and boiled and held up to that treatment a lot more than a fabric with a dye that was usually could often be like a vegetable dye that wouldn't hold fast. So white was actually more practical for children. And in terms of what society is trying to tell children at that point, basically these are, it's an indistinct group. There's not a whole lot of individuality that's encouraged in very small children. The goal is to mainly keep these kids alive, and as they develop personality traits, to make sure that they stay obedient to their parents. There are really kind of defined expectations. And while it is an era that permits a greater indulgence of childhood than say colonial times did, there's still like this familial hierarchy where little kids are distinctly at the bottom. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from a domestic advice manual of the time. With most children, there is an era, and this often happens when the child is about emerging from babyhood, in which a struggle is made for the mastery, and the question has to be promptly decided: who is to rule, the child or the parent? Vigorous measures will be necessary at this juncture, and punishment, decisive and repeated until submission on the part of the child is complete, will only answer the end desired. So, women and children in general are put on a track at this point to fulfill a kind of submissive, and in the case of women, as we'll see, sometimes even downright servile role in their families. So moving forward, and I do want to stop and say that the images associated, that all these garments are from the Illinois State Museum's collections and were on display in the exhibit I mentioned. The images are not directly associated with the garment. So it's not a literal photograph of a historical child wearing this exact thing. I've tried to match our garments with period photographs to give you a sense of what they looked like on a living, breathing person, but it is by no means the same person that wore the garment. So moving into small childhood, girls typically wore little dresses that had kind of knee to calf length skirts and panelettes under. This is when you start to see gender distinctions emerging between boys and girls clothing. Little kids, when they're all in their white dresses, the main distinction was making sure that little kids look different from adults. So they were all in one kind of blob of white clothing. By the time a child hits 3, the little girl is still in an outfit like we see here. Little boys tend to go into short pants, and this is a milestone in a boy's life. They're considered breeched at this point. The next milestone in the little boy's life will be going into his long pants around somewhere between the age of, like, let's say 10 to 14. As for girls, we're starting to see some gender roles start to be imposed onto their life, and girls are being trained at this point to pick up the responsibilities and the roles that they're meant to carry through for the rest of their life. So in this image, for example, we see this girl is holding a doll, kind of the classic feminine plaything, which also carried an instructive quality in the 19th century, as it was meant to help train girls to be maternal, to learn how to care for something other than themselves. This is also about the time when a little girl would get a needle put in her hand and she would learn how to make and mend clothing. And she would be expected to sort of help her mother out around the house. And so the message that society starts to give to children and little girls in particular is that they need to conform their will to those of the family in order to preserve family harmony. And again, quoting from domestic advice manuals of the time, an 1855 writer says, "There is really nothing more important to the happiness than early learning to yield your will to that of others. The happiness of your parents and home depend much upon your conduct." And then she goes on to enumerate a lot of do's and don'ts for girls. Never raise your voice. Don't speak until spoken to at the table. Be prompt, be tidy. Don't be talkative. Don't be rude. Don't be lazy. Don't be in ill humor. Don't carry with you a glum look. It looks selfish and cold and throws a damp upon the whole circle. So basically, swallow whatever it is you're feeling and put on a happy face so you don't bum anyone else out. Moving on through life, the tween years is the sort of like in-between state of young womanhood and girlhood. It's kind of like the last gasp of girlhood. So in terms of the clothing tends to mimic adult women's style, with the exception of the skirts are still short at this point. They hit to below the knee, mid-calf-ish. They don't get long until a girl is considered like fully mature and out in society and then on the marriage market. So this is the last time in a girl's life when she'll sort of have the freedom of play that comes from being a kid and not a young woman. And there's this wonderful quote from Frances Willard, the suffragette, who says, she's talking about her 18th birthday and says, "This is my birthday and the date of my martyrdom. Mother insists that at last I must have my hair done up woman fashion. My back hair is twisted up like a corkscrew. I carry 18 hairpins. My head aches miserably. My feet are entangled in the skirt of my hateful new gown. I can never jump over a fence again so long as I live." And 18 is actually a little late. So I think her mom kind of probably did her a favor by letting her go until 18. Some women kind of take this step into womanhood at age 15, 16. And so Frances really clearly articulates the sort of loss of freedom as she perceives it, of being able to run and play and have her hair down, that comes when she assumes that role of a grown woman. That said, if one is a middle-class woman, the period of young womanhood can be one of fairly significant freedom in her life, probably like the peak that she will experience. And again, this is middle-class women who are not working outside the home. If they are in a household where they don't have to work and their mother is still alive and managing the household, then their duties are relatively light. They are going to be expected to help out in the household, manage younger siblings, help with the sewing, but they're not the ones in charge. Their main goal at this point in the middle class is to meet a husband. And so this is a time of social engagements and being courted and really like a lot of relative freedom in their lives. And this is reflected in the clothing that women are wearing at this time. As we said, coming into young adulthood, the skirts now are down at the floor. And this is a signal that like you are a woman, the hair gets pinned up. And this is a time when young women like, and it's the same today, if you're a trendy person, like the trends come out in youth, the young women tend to be the most fashion conscious, the most into like, what's the latest style. They're the ones who are going to be wearing the vibrant clothes. And the domestic advice manuals sort of give tacit permission to this. They talk about how Sober colors are more appropriate for middle age and older age, but certain gaiety and brightness of attire are suitable for youth. If, however, you are a working class woman, young womanhood is a time for work. And it's probably a time when you've transitioned out of working within your household to working outside the household for the support of the family. It could be to help put a sibling through school. It could be just helping your family's bottom line. Maybe you're going out to work to earn your own money, but a woman might engage in domestic service. She might engage in factory work. She might be hired help on a farm. And so this is a time when women are donning work clothes, and the dress that you see there is considered a work dress. These tend to be of dark colored, small print cotton. And this is a very practical choice for a work outfit. One, because the dark color is very forgiving for any dirt or soiling that might happen on the course of the job. A small figure is also helpful because when clothes get worn out, they're not discarded, they're mended and often remade. And the process of remaking literally can mean taking a garment apart, cutting out places that are too worn to be used, and restitching it up together. And so when you have a small figured pattern, it's a lot easier to match those prints and remake a garment than if you have something big and bold. And finally, the cotton calico holds up to a wash a lot better than any other fabric does. Women tended to, and we're talking like 1850s, 60s here, the height of the hoop skirt era, most women generally didn't wear those hoops when they're engaged in work. And this is true whether they're out working for wages or whether they're working within their home. Hoops are, they're sort of an encumbrance, and it's just more practical to go without them. They probably would have gone with petticoats, maybe a corded or stiffened petticoat to lend fullness to an outfit without the full-on circumference of a hoop. That said, there are cartoons that appeared in the period that sort of poked fun at domestic servants for wearing hoops. And the caption on this, the missus is saying, "Mary, go and take that thing off directly. Pray, are you aware of what a ridiculous object you are?" And of course, the punchline is that the lady of the house, who's bending forward and showing her pantalettes and her socks and shoes, is equally ridiculous and is unaware of it and coming down on poor Mary here. But this shows that there's also this sort of like class distinction. And as egalitarian as America was, there was still a hierarchy that especially, middle-class women and employers try to enforce onto their hired help. Their hired help are obviously free to make whatever sartorial choices they want, but the lady of the house, you often read in letters and contemporary accounts that the lady of the house gets annoyed because the hired help is dressing above their station and not embracing this role of servitude or being a second-class citizen within the home. Meanwhile, a domestic servant who's working for wages and having her room and board paid for has disposable income and is excited to spend those wages on nice clothes and have nice dresses. Okay, moving on to becoming a bride. So this is a pivotal point of transformation in a woman's life. And the 19th century didn't really encourage women to seek or hold the limelight, but becoming a bride, getting married, is one of the few socially acceptable times when you do step into that limelight. Your name goes in the paper, you have people coming to celebrate you. And in the 19th century, the choice of a romantic partner and marriage partner was probably the biggest choice that a woman could make. We have come from the colonial era where marriage was more of an economic contract where, congeniality factored into it. And it was great if you got along and one hoped to love their spouse. But there's also things like, if you live here and the neighboring boy lives here and your pieces of farmland abut, and you can get married and keep all that land in the family, like that's a really compelling reason to get married. Or if your fathers have similar economic interests, or you belong to the same church, there's all these sort of societal bargains that go into it. In the 19th century, we move into the ideal of companionate marriage, where marriages really are chosen based on ideals of love and affection and a mutually satisfying relationship. And parents have stepped back of the role of being the gatekeeper and allowed their daughters more freedom of choice, with the caveat that, like, you need to choose well, because women still don't have the legal rights to be a separate entity. A lot of states practice femme covert laws, where once you become married, your legal identity is subsumed to your husband. So if your husband has addiction issues or is abusive or even unkind, your life will not go well from that point. So it's this huge pivotal moment in a woman's life. All eyes are on her, and she's taking the step into the unknown and sort of hoping that she has chosen well. In terms of attire, you could have a white wedding dress or you could have a colorful wedding dress, and both were equally valid in the 19th century. Queen Victoria did sort of spark a fashion for white wedding dresses when she married Prince Albert in 1840. For Queen Victoria, she was showing off her wealth as much as her, purity. And she was also showing off British-made lace in her gown. White was a very difficult color to achieve, and especially to maintain in the 19th century. So having a white dress in a time when people are walking down muddy streets and walking into houses with, wooden coal burning fireplaces, that was sort of a status symbol. So it was perfectly acceptable for women to get married in a best dress that could really be of any color. And the image that you see on the right, this is the exception. That actually is the woman. Her name is Eliza, and I forgot her last name, but that is her dress and a photo of her in the dress. And so she has had a very nice dress created for the occasion, and it is almost certainly not the last time that she will wear it. She will continue to use it as her best dress, and as time goes on, she will probably alter it so it'll kind of stay current and in season for many years to come, as was common practice and was, perfectly socially acceptable at the time. So now the bride, the former young married woman, or young single woman, is a young married woman. And Mary Todd, the future Mrs. Lincoln, wrote to a friend in 1840 and said, "Why is it that married folks always become so serious?" And there's a clear reason for that, and it's because keeping a household in the 19th century is a lot of work. And women have taken the step from being a contributing member of a household that's managed presumably by their mothers, if their mothers are still alive, to being the manager of a household. And now she is responsible for getting food on the table for her husband and any other members of the household, for keeping this household clean, for keeping it furnished, for in the 19th century put all these like moral expectations on women to be the light of the household and the moral responsibility. And it's a lot of work. And a lot of women find themselves just overwhelmed by the magnitude of labor that goes into housekeeping. And then coupled with that, society is asking women to do this job and to either like it, or if they don't like it, like, again, swallow that down. And so here's another quote from a domestic advice manual: "A really good housekeeper is almost always unhappy. While she does so much for the comfort of others, she nearly ruins her own health and life. It is because she cannot be easy and comfortable when there is the least disorder or dirt to be seen." Another advice manual says, comfort for her family is provided, even at the expense of many an exhausted nerve and an aching heart. So this role that society has asked women to fulfill is one of self-sacrifice and of, you put everyone's needs in the household above yours and you come last. And again, women who previously have, been out on the social scene, being courted, going to parties, their mom was doing the heavy lifting in the house, step into this, and it's really kind of a harsh wake-up call. So the garment we're looking at here belonged to a woman named Susan Watson of Jackson County. She was a farmer's wife, and she created this garment completely from scratch. She raised the sheep that provided the wool, she spun and dyed the cloth, and then she sewed the garment herself. So sort of emblematic of the wide range of domestic chores that fell on women at the young married stage of their life. And then usually hot on the heels of marriage comes pregnancy. And pregnancy obviously took a toll on women's bodies. And I'm interested to ponder what kind of toll it took on their psyches as well, because of the specter of maternal mortality. It was quite common for women to die in childbirth. 1 in 100 births resulted in the death of the mother. So not 1 in 100 women, if you give birth 9 times, each time you have a 1 in 100 chance of dying in childbirth. Women, by the time they've reached childbearing age, they undoubtedly have seen someone die in childbirth, a mother, a sister, a female relative. So there had to have been the sense of existential coming to terms with, I'm about to undergo something that in the best case scenario will be very painful in the end, and at the worst case, I won't survive, and then do it again and again and again. So in terms of what pregnancy did to a woman's kind of moving about in the world, women tended to for the very last stages of their pregnancy, they were entered what was called confinement, where they would kind of withdraw from society and basically sit and wait for the baby to be born. I did find a woman who was writing letters during a pregnancy, and I was able to track where she was and what she was doing. And she's still going to church 6 weeks before delivery. She's still receiving visitors 5 weeks out from her delivery. And she starts to pull things in about 3 weeks before delivery. In terms of what women were wearing, there was no such thing as maternity clothes per se in the era. What women did was take existing garments and alter them for pregnancy. And clothes making and clothes mending and clothes making over was just sort of a constant part of life. And so it just sort of followed that when you become pregnant, you would let out the seams, you might add a drawstring inside. And then when, the pregnancy is over, when you've delivered, you alter that garment back and you keep wearing it, and then maybe you change it again. So it's constantly in the state of flux. And for this reason, there's not a whole lot of maternity clothes that actually survive from the 19th century, because in most cases, when the pregnancy is over, the garment is no longer a maternity garment, it's just an everyday garment again. We have 2 examples in the Illinois State Museum's collections, and both of the women who owned them in the 19th century sadly died in childbirth. And I wonder if that's the reason that these garments survive, is because these women actually didn't live to continue wearing them and alter them back to a pre-pregnancy state. Okay, and then after pregnancy comes child rearing, and again, this is like a physical toll on a woman's body, right? She needs to make her body available for this infant for breastfeeding. And so the garment we're looking at here is called a wrapper, and this is like a house coat. It's an at-home garment. It's not something that would be worn in company, and definitely not outside the house. It was meant to be sort of something you put on before you dress fully for the day. And so this is the garment of choice for especially nursing mothers, because it tended to have simple button closures or even tie closures, which made the breast very accessible for breastfeeding. And if anyone's listening who's had children, those first few weeks and months postpartum, it's getting dressed in a fancy outfit is not at the top of your list of priorities. And what's interesting about this photograph is that this woman here is being photographed in a wrapper. You can see kind of her undergarment peeking out at the collar, and you can see how her skirt is open at the bottom, showing her petticoat. And the conjecture is that her infant has passed away, and the photographer has come to her house to take this postmortem photo of a very young infant to kind of record the baby's image for posterity. And the mother is, probably still recovering from childbirth and isn't leaving the house, because that outfit that she's wearing is not one that would have kind of been considered socially acceptable for her to leave the house in. And that same woman who I mentioned, who I was tracking the letters and what she was up to pre-delivery, gives us this wonderful, wonderful quote after her baby's born. She says, "I'm afraid now it's too late for the mail, but I will try and finish with baby on my lap. How I do wish the colicky time was over. The ladies just now are having a good many little strawberry gatherings, which are very pleasant, but as usual, I am prevented from participating. When my children grow up, I hope to have great comfort in them, for I certainly have been a slave to their interests the best part of my life." And so she really cuts to the chase, because the 19th century really idealizes motherhood and this role of, the happy, beatific, serene mother whose only happiness in life is being surrounded by all her children. And Mary Stuart in that letter tells us, I'm missing out on a party. I have put myself second so long throughout my life, and I hope this pays off for me in the end, which is just this lovely, raw, real contrast to the ideal that she's been presented with and is supposed to be living up to. Okay, so I'm going to divert here and consider a couple outfits that reflect the ways that women did carve out space for themselves in the world. You've seen how there's a lot being asked of women and a lot of self-sacrifice in service of others asked of women in the 19th century. But women did manage to, claim some space, especially in the public sphere for themselves, and especially after the Civil War. There tends to be this evolving ideal of women where the idea of this kind of homebound and sort of inherently frail and shrinking woman is gradually replaced by an ideal of a kind of healthy, robust, active, outdoorsy type of woman. And so you see, especially after the Civil War, women out on hikes and doing archery and playing croquet and things like that. But perhaps the greatest symbol of women's freedom at that time is the bicycle. And the bicycle means that women can go by themselves and they can travel at greater speeds than they have ever traveled before. It literally expands the physical boundaries of women's roles. And Susan B. Anthony said, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world." And so with this greater, acceptance of and kind of claiming of physical activity, you see a shift in women's clothing in the late 19th century. You see garments that are constructed that actually, permit this physical movement and are less tied up in petticoats and snaps and buttons and kind of easier to move in. So what you're looking at here is a bicycle outfit, and behind the front flap there, if you were to unbutton it and lift it up, you would see that this is actually a pair of wide leg pants that are sort of hidden, for modesty or whatever sake, by that flap in the front, but it's split leg. And this is to facilitate that bike riding. So, it's easy for her to pedal and so her skirts don't get tangled up in the wheels there. And then you also have working women. You have a big push after the Civil War of women entering the workforce, and especially joining white collar professions like being a typist or a secretary or an office assistant. And again, you have clothing reflecting these changing roles. So whereas 19th century clothing was very it's constrictive, and it tends to be like one piece, a bodice that's hooked to a skirt. These now you have in the late 19th century, the rise of separates. So you've got, the blouse and skirt combo. You've got things that are easier to put on, easier to wash and care for. You can mix and match them. And so that blouse there is known as a shirtwaist blouse. It's modeled after, like a man's dress shirt. And it's sort of emblematic of the freedom that women are experiencing in going out and having their own version of business attire and making their way into the world that way. Going back, the matron was the top of our pyramid there, remember? She's at the very apex. And in terms of, the ideals that society is pushing, the matrons tend to have kind of the most like social power. Once you have gotten through and survived childbirth and established yourself in your community, at this point, you are presumably, if you're a middle-class woman, you are active in your church, you are active in your community, you are raising a successful household, and really kind of hitting your stride and finding your voice. But there are these sort of etiquette expectations that this is not the time for you to join the red hat club and dress in red hats and feather boas. Like, you also are expected to kind of like be muted and wear dark sober colors and like have this kind of gravitas and dignity of a matron. A stage that many women went through was widowhood, although statistically men did outlive their wives in the 19th century, mainly due to the perils inherent in childbearing. But say a woman outlived her husband, she became a widow, and there were certain expectations for how she would dress and comport herself afterwards. And I'm going to lead off with the caveat that mourning was an intensely personal choice. There was what the etiquette manuals prescribed, and then there's the reality of your financial means and your practical realities of everyday life. If you're out working, or maybe you need to start taking in laundry to support your family because you're a widow, or maybe you kind of just don't feel like it, and you're in a supportive community that's not going to make you do the whole years-long mourning process. So the prescribed rules for mourning were like totally, individualized to each person experiencing them. But that said, society did lay out, prescriptions for mourning, and it generally went along the lines of, for the death of a spouse, a woman should expect to spend 6 months to a year in deepest mourning. And this means like flat black, no jewelry, no embellishment, nothing shiny. Often like a bonnet with a veil, like this woman's wearing here in her picture. Like you are a non-person because you are grieving so hard. And then after that comes another 6 months to a year of second stage mourning. And at this point, you might start wearing like jet jewelry, or like have a little like cuff at your like a little white cuff at your wrist here. So the image that we're showing here is of a second stage mourning gown, still in all black, just kind of introducing little pieces of embellishment. And then this is followed by another 6 months of half mourning. And this is where you gradually reintroduce color to your life again. And you start with like lavender or gray, or really kind of like ease into, joining the social world again and kind of being on the marriage market again. And like I said, this is totally like what's prescribed, but tempered by the realities of, your financial situation, your work situation, whether, you need to get married right away to support your children and what's going on in people's lives. And then when we reach the stage of being an older woman, there are certain kind of sartorial freedoms that are permitted to older women. And one of them being older women are given a pass on corsets. And this is not to say that corsets are like torture chambers or, cages. They kind of get a bad rap. They're not like the Kim Kardashian waist trainers that we might think they are. They're generally like a support garment that's meant to support the back and breasts of the wearer and provide a smooth foundation for the garments being worn. That said, if you are 80 years old and you feel like you've worn them your life and you're fine going without, okay, society is okay with that. So we're looking at an image of Lucy McWhirter. She was a free Black woman in Illinois who, with her husband, founded the town of New Philadelphia in Pike County. And Lucy is wearing a classic older woman outfit of this fan pleated garment that's very loose. Lucy might not have a corset on. She's wearing a day cap, which is sort of, if you're a younger woman in a day cap, it's kind of like you're kind of covering a bad hair day. But as an older woman, it's sort of like a convention, like women tended to wear day caps in older age. Again, you're meant to be wearing kind of muted colors, and the domestic advice manual says, neither will an elderly lady attire herself in gaudy colors, nor wear a profusion of ornaments, nor affect habillements which become young people. To do so in advanced years will militate against the respect and deference which it demands, and assuredly subject the ancient to contempt and ridicule. So while you get a little bit of freedom and, not having to do the elaborate hairstyles and letting go of the corset if you want to, neither are you permitted the level of self-expression that a younger woman was permitted and encouraged to do in society. So kind of a mixed bag there. And then the final image I'm going to share with you is of clothes that a woman might wear after life when she is deceased. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a trigger warning here. I am going to show a post-mortem photograph in the next slide. So if you are uncomfortable with that, please avert your eyes right now. So in the 19th century, for the most part, death and funerals took place in the home. The funeral parlor as a commercial business where you sent your dead loved ones to be cared for didn't really gain steam until after the Civil War, and really not until the later part of the 19th century. Until then, death was a very private and family-oriented activity, and the living women of the house are given charge of washing and preparing a body for viewing and burial. And because this is pre-embalming, this needs to happen really quickly. Generally, people were buried the day after they had passed away. So in terms of garments that a deceased person might wear, sometimes people and women were buried in the clothes that they had in life, and this could have certain symbolic meanings. People were often dressed in their night clothes, which was symbolic of the idea of death as just kind of an eternal sleep. People might also be dressed in traveling clothes, and this symbolized the idea of death as a journey that they were taking. They might also be wear a shroud. And a shroud is, it's like a dress-like garment that it looks similar to, an everyday kind of dress, but it was meant for a deceased person. So it would have been easier to put on. It would have had larger sleeves, and the fastenings in the back would have been, designed in mind for, you were dressing a body, not, someone putting on clothes on themselves. after the Civil War, when death starts to move out of the home, you start to have the rise of embalming, the rise of funeral parlors, the rise of a professional undertaker who's taking charge of the body and preparing it for burial. You also have the rise of the availability of mass-produced burial clothing. And that's what we're seeing off to the right there. That is a burial garment that's actually still in the box. I say mass produced, they're hand sewn or machine sewn, typically by women, and kind of created in such a way, if we were to unbox that garment there, it looks very finished at the part that we can see, the way it's folded. And that would correspond to what would be visible in a casket, right? Like your neck, your sleeves, your upper torso, all those details are very finished on a burial garment. The rest of it is like just basted together and, you know, rough seams, rough construction on the inside, because it literally was about presenting a nice view for what would be seen, and the rest of it kind of didn't matter. And that's sort of where this ends, which is sort of maybe a grim note to end on, but I'm going to finish up with our slide coming full circle, having gone through the life stages of clothing for women in the 19th century. And wanted to thank everyone for attending, and now's the time to open up for questions and discussion.
Oh, my word, Erika, that was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. I mean, I felt like my whole life in front of me right now, honestly. So, and everyone else as well. So, actually, I have a few questions for you while we get more questions in. During your research, what actually surprised you the most?
That is an interesting question. You know, I was drawn to like the after death garments, and there's not a whole lot of information out there on them, but I was fascinated to learn the options for dressing people. And there are some cases that have come to light where they're iron coffins where people are hermetically sealed when they're buried, and they, you know, come to light during construction projects or whatever. And like the person and the garments are still intact, and so you can actually see what people are buried in. And so this idea of, you know, creating a shroud especially for death, and some people would even make it like with their trousseau, right? So they've got their like clothing for their married life up until, you know, their death. And also the symbolic idea of like, you know, choosing an outfit very carefully, because you are, you know, metaphorically sending someone on a journey or putting them to bed for a long sleep.
Yeah, no, and then also this is a morbid part now that we're talking about the deceased dress. Like if a child were to die, you know, of a childhood illness like scarlet fever, for example, like how would they dress the child?
Same things applied, either garments in life, or there were child-sized shrouds. And actually the example that we have in our museum collection is like a child's burial garment, which is like, you know, like heartbreaking.
Yeah. Anyway, but oh my gosh, I was like fascinated by the nursing garments. How did women socialize? Did they go out? Because I know every few hours you have to go back and nurse your baby.
Right. And so a lot of what I've been able to glean is through that women's letters and other, you know, my research tends to be focused in Springfield and, you know, Illinois, because that's where I'm at. But yeah, it seems like women's social activities are really curtailed. You know, you, like you said, you're on the clock. You maybe have 2 hours, and then that baby needs to eat again. So for the first several months of, you know, an infant's life, you need to stick close to home, and that's your world.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up and see. We have a lot of questions, actually. One of them was one of the first questions. I'm not sure what this question is, but it's about buttons. Were there a lot of like I guess I saw some garments that had a lot of buttons, and I guess it took a while for people to get dressed. So I guess would they have servants that would help them get dressed? I guess it depends on the garment, right?
It is, and it evolved like through the 19th century. So in the Regency era, like the Jane Austen era, you might be fastening with like a tie, like the kiddie clothes, or like a safety pin. When you get to like the 1830s, 1840s, 18, yeah, you have hook and eyes that are in the back. So yeah, like picture tiny little hook and eyes down your back, which would have been challenging to get dressed in. Although, like, you know, not impossible, because not everyone has domestic help, right? Like you have to be able to put on your own clothes. And then the hook and eyes tend to move to the front in the 1850s and 1860s. And then in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, you get like this like renaissance of these beautiful buttons. Like they can be hand painted or made out of shell, or they're all very like beautiful and elaborate. And then in the 1890s, you have this last gasp of like very complicated clothes where it's like hook and eyes here, and it fastens here, and it fastens here, and it fastens around your neck. And so like, yeah, they were complicated clothes, but they were meant to show like a very precise fit, and clothing was fit to an individual, right? There's no like off the rack. It's like your bodice is made like to your measurements, like your bust, your waist. If you gain weight, that means you're like altering your garment because it's not going to fit anymore, because it's so like precise to your silhouette.
And then on the same topic of buttons, were the buttons taken off before washing usually, or did they leave them on?
So people washed their inner garments. So you wear layers underneath, and the foundational garment is like a chemise, which is basically like a nightgown. And so that's the thing that's closest to your body and absorbing the dirt and oils. And that tends to have like, you know, maybe like a little button at your neck or something. And so that was, you leave that on, but it certainly could come off in the wash. And I've seen in letters where people say like, oh, my washing has come back, I need to check it over and mend it now, you know, because if you're like scrubbing it, yeah, it's going to get loose. But the more elaborate, you know, like your bodice and your outer garments don't get washed per se. They get, you know, they'll get spot clean, but hopefully all the like sweat and dirt is going to be absorbed by those inner layers.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there was a question about, and I'll read this. You mentioned how clothing was adapted to allow women to be more physically active, such as the bicycle riding costume. But what about the effects of corsets on women's ability to be physically active in such restrictive effects on the torso?
That's awesome. I have an image and I wish I could show it, but it's of like a woman around the year 1900 in a corset and touching her toes. So like, as I said, corsets kind of get a bad rap. There were some women like tend to be younger and like very fashion conscious who would tight lace, right? Like try to get your waist as absolute small as possible, like Scarlett O'Hara. Generally, people didn't do that. They didn't lace them that tight, and the corset wasn't as constrictive as we imagine it would be, you know. So the answer to that question is they just did all those things in a corset. You know, they went hiking and they played tennis and whatever, and they had a corset, and it was just like a foundational garment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can imagine that actually a corset would actually give them good posture as well.
Sure, right, yeah.
You know,
back support.
Sometimes I wear that for that reason. Yeah. And then there was another question. When did young girls start to wear a corset? So when does a young woman start wearing a corset?
That would have been that leap that Frances Willard was talking about when she couldn't jump over fences. There's a little bit of individuality in it, but you know, when your skirts come down, your hair goes up, you would probably also go into a corset. So it might be as early as like 14, 15, it might be as late as 18, but somewhere in that kind of teenage years is when you like made that social transition into womanhood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then the average waist measurements for an unpregnant woman, what was the average waist measurements?
It was small. It's like 22 inches in the 19th century.
That's amazing.
It is. And like, It was something like between the, I don't know, 1950s and 1970s, or like the American like waist jumped from like 24 to 32. It's like in the 20th century that like, you know, waist sizes have really like gone up in size in America.
They sure have. um, there was another question about how did the museum acquire the garments and the photos, and were they donated or were they purchased?
They were all donated. Some of them come in individually, and then, so as the state museum, we have the right of first refusal if another state entity like closes. And in our case, we absorbed the textile collections of both the University of Illinois and Illinois State Museum. So that really like kind of bolstered our holdings.
Okay, and then also too, there was other question, but I'm gonna actually maybe alter it slightly. The question, the original question is, did fashions always come from Europe? But maybe the real question is, how were they influenced? Like, what was the fashion influence? Did they mostly come from Europe?
They did in the 19th century. They tended to come out of like Paris especially. And so there's these like French fashion plates, and they would make their way to the United States. And then popular American publications like Godey's Ladies Book or Peterson's Magazine, they would take those French fashion plates and they would literally like copy them. You know, they would have someone redraw them for their books and send them out. And so what you got in the fashion magazines was the ideal, right? It's like us looking through, you know, like Vogue or something. Like most people aren't going to be wearing the like fashion plate look with all the bows and flippy things or whatever, but you're going to look at it and you'll be like, oh, you're putting bows on your shoulder this season, right? So it's more like inspiration that people would then kind of incorporate into their own clothing.
Yeah. Getting back to that photograph that you had of the that reminds me, the garment for when the woman is actually riding a bicycle and it's all in green. I noticed that most of your pictures didn't have green dresses, but that one was. And I understand that actually green was actually a very poisonous dye. And I'm wondering,
Yes.
and maybe you can explain that to our audience about that, maybe elaborate on that a little bit, since we're talking about from the cradle to the grave.
Sure. So the 19th century saw a lot of advances in synthetic dyes. And the first one happened in the 1850s, and that was the color purple. And it was actually synthesized by someone who was trying to create quinine to treat malaria and didn't achieve quinine, but he achieved purple dye instead. So in like the 1850s, you see this explosion of purple, because whereas before that was kind of a hard dye to achieve, like with natural dyes, synthetically you get these like brilliant colors and people love them. And then after that, it's like more synthetic dyes and chemical dyes become available. And one, like you mentioned, is green, which is like arsenic based. And so I think the Met had an exhibit not too long ago about like poisonous fashion, right? Where it's literally like your clothes are poisonous. And so that bicycle outfit you're making, because I like, you know, I handled that. I'm wondering like, oh boy, I hope I wash my hands. Like, and I can't say, you know, because that garment's from the 1890s, and the, you know, the synthetic green came out in the 1860s. I hope that they figured it out and, you know, were able to like change the formula to something not poisonous, but I don't actually know, you know, the timeline.
I mean, that garment that you showed, I mean, I got just a photograph, but do you have any garments that actually are in green? Because I mean, I would assume you would have to handle it with gloves if you were.
We do, yeah, we do have several, yeah. Bright, vibrant, poisonous green.
Make a note of that, everyone. Now, so someone wrote, you focused on the turn of the century, but not the evolution of fashion as women evolved in society. Can you comment on that?
Right. So that was just the like constraints of space and time, you know, like, and that's totally a valid ways to look that would have been a more chronological like time period talk, right? Like what are women's roles from like 1820 through 1860? Yeah, so that's certainly a valid approach that I just didn't take. But in general, so you start with like the Regency era, which is like kind of like loose in terms of like you're not wearing a tight corset, you don't have a defined waist. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you've got this is at the height of like the ideal of the like woman as angel in the house, this ideal wife and mother and whatever. And women are like, the dress makes women very ornamental, right? It's like the hourglass, like the small waist, the big skirt, the, you know, lots of layers and things that really kind of constricts movement. And then after the Civil War, then you get into clothing that permits a little bit more ease of movement, is easier to care for, that like, you know, the bicycle dress, the separate skirt and blouse.
Yeah, yeah. So what's next for you? What are you working on next?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I am working on an exhibit called Growing Up X that's going to dive into being part of Generation X and what kind of like toys and technologies and cultural touchstones shaped Generation X, which is, you know, like the quintessentially overlooked generation that's stuck between baby boomers and millennials, and everyone's forgotten about us. And so it's Gen X's time to shine. And that exhibit will open at the end of January at the State Museum.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, well, I want to thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I know there were so many more questions but we didn't get a chance to get to, and I apologize for that. And but thank you so much. And by the way, if you are interested in the programs of the National Arts Club, you could visit us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And you can also visit us at thenationalartsclub.org. I'm Catherine Kleszczewski. This is Erika Holst. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.